Hello, my name is Wyatt Ivanov, and today I'll be giving an informative speech over the Cold War and the legacy of the Cold War. The Cold War existed between the age of 1947 and 1991. It was when the world existed in a state of geopolitical tension due to a philosophical polarization between the Western and Eastern blocs after World War II. So, first I'll be discussing the repercussions of the Cold War on many regions of the world. Then I'll be discussing how the anxiety of the Soviet Union prompted the significance of NATO, and finally I'll be discussing how the legacy of the Cold War still exists today. So in the period between 1947 and 1991, the world was in a state of geopolitical tension after World War II. Due to the polarization between the Western and Eastern blocs, the Soviet Union and NATO alliances staged propaganda fronts in countries that were not yet consumed by the sphere of influence of the two powers. So the propaganda fronts sought to delegitimize the influence on both powers. So both powers also engaged in political engagements that divided countries in order to delegitimize the strategic influence those countries the two powers may have had over those hosting countries. And another significant problem the Cold War had was that a lot of these countries fell victim to proxy wars to serve as puppeteers to destabilize regions of the world that would otherwise serve as a puppet to the Soviet or NATO alliances. So both powers sought to always maintain an impressive arsenal of weapons, and this only grew the tensions between the Soviet and NATO alliances. And I get this from the Free Dictionary by Frolics of the Cold War. So one of the most critical points in the Cold War is when Ronald Reagan physically addressed Premier Gorbachev at the Berlin Wall. The Berlin Wall was an actual physical construct that separated the Western and Eastern blocs and divided straight down the capital of Germany, known as Berlin. This was one of Ronald Reagan's famous speeches in 1987 when Ronald Reagan addressed Premier Gorbachev in his famous speech, and I quote, "General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come to this gate, Mr. Gorbachev. Open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." Another significant repercussion in many regions of the world due to the Cold War were the Balkan regions, the Middle Eastern, Asian, South American, and African regions that are also still existing the condition of the world today. So an example of this is in Ethiopia, and I quote Jane Perales as he states, "A long pro-American Ethiopia, a pre-industrial country with 50 million people, joined the Soviet camp in 1977, and it was rewarded with Cuban troops and billions of dollars of military equipment via the Soviet Union. Washington responded by pumping arms and money into the vacuum left by Moscow and the neighboring Somalia, a desert strip of 6 million nomads. Today, Ethiopia, its 30 years of war over, holds a fragile peace with the government that says it wants to instill a democracy. But this has yet to receive any economic aid from Washington as promised. The former embassy, once full of military attaches and diplomats, is now virtually empty." End quote. Another example is evident in the Middle East. So I get this from the Soviet Cold War in Asia and Middle East Library, and I begin the quote by stating, "The Cold War struggles were also occurring in the Middle East. Strategically important as supply of oil, the region appeared vulnerable in 1946. As a region, when the Soviet troops failed to leave Iran as promised, even after British and American forces had already withdrawn, the U.S. demanded that UN condemns Moscow's continued troop presence. When the United States observed Soviet tanks entering the region, Washington readied for a direct clash. Confronted by U.S. resolve, the Soviets withdrew." End quote. So another example of the Cold War tensions is stated by Falkov in monographs, and he states that in the old days of the Cold War, the United States would have felt obligated to step in and help, not for economic purposes, but for a philosophical obligation. But because they sensed that if they did not prop up populist governments in these countries that were not yet subjected to the influence of the Soviet Union, he states that they would be replaced by regimes far more radical and possibly even allied with the Soviet Union. End quote. And from a direct quote by Nigel Ashton on the Cold War on the Periphery, the case of King Hussein of Jordan in 2006, he states that from the perspective of King Hussein of Jordan, he understood that there would be no independence from the two great powers, the Soviet Union and the NATO alliance. He states, Hussein, in that in the great struggle between communism and freedom, there can be no neutrality. End quote. So this was the former Soviet Union, and after the Soviet Union collapsed, the Soviet territory of Ukraine is now a independent country. And I get this image from www.npr.org. So history indicates without a doubt that Ukraine and Russia have had a problematic relationship. But perhaps the main problem is that the internal struggle within the country itself. Ukraine is known for its cultural divide, which is a bigger part of the issue of the Ukrainian crisis, and the pro-Russian separatists engaged in a heated conflict against the pro-Ukrainians who had recently forced former President Yanukovych out of the Ukraine, establishing their own government. And he continues by, there is no doubt about the high anxiety that is still keeping the world on its toes. I state this from Shane Koda on the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, 2015. So the anxiety of the Cold War still exists today. You see many examples of the NATO's military extensions and institutions virtually surrounding Russia on this map provided. These blue stars represent NATO bases. So, as quoted by an article on the Forbes, is NATO puts troops on high alert in readiness for confrontation in Russia 2016. So NATO chiefs thrown into a panic by fears of the Russian President Vladimir Putin might attack the West and are scrambling to put together a force of 300,000 troops and put them on high alert. This is the anxiety I have addressed, that the anxiety of the Cold War still exists because NATO still stands ready in case of a Russian Federation's military advance into territories. So the legacy of the Cold War is very relevant in the world today. NATO's anxiety of the Soviet Union exists on an alert attitude, and NATO extends to Russia, and the condition of proxy regions is evidence in the turmoil created by the influence of both of these powers, and that brings much significance to NATO in today's world. The anxiety that the Russian Federation may be holding the ideal that they want to reclaim their lost territories is very existing. So the Cold War era may be over, but the Soviet Union dissolved. But the repercussions of the Cold War still weigh very heavy in our hearts, and it's very significant that we understand the exact history of the Cold War. Therefore, we can understand exactly what frameworked us in today's world. Thank you.
Hey, Dwight.
Sure.
Good to see you.
Yeah.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Congratulations.
Congratulations. Awesome.
Congratulations.
Thank you.